All right. Well, that being said, Michael, take it away.
All right, so we're planning on having this as an interactive Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question, feel free to write it in the chat or use the raise hand function. But to start, I think we can ask Dr. Grobe, for his general history and uh, maybe his origin stories as far as psychedelic research goes.
My origin story. So we don't have time for enough time for that, but I'll give you the short version, which is, I grew up in the '60s. I went off to college in the late '60s. I remember before I left for college, my mother showed me an article in Life magazine of a photo montage of a teenage girl freaking out on LSD, and in all sorts of ways. And my mother said, "Promise me you'll never do this." And I said, "Of course, Mom. You shouldn't have to ask. You know me. I would never dream of doing such a thing." Well, fast forward about 8 months, a beautiful spring day at Oberlin College, and the opportunity presented. I had observed that some of the more interesting classmates had had firsthand psychedelic experience, and I was just very curious, and it kind of all took off from there. I did a few experiences late '60s in college, and then I had a realization that taking such a powerful drug like LSD or the other psychedelics in the context of a college dormitory was maybe not the ideal environment. So it could get very unpredictable. So I felt I needed to just step back. But it had tweaked my interest, and I just read everything I could. And then a few years later, I got a job in New York, in Brooklyn, at the Maimonides Medical Center Dream Research Laboratory, where my job was staying up all night and monitoring EEGs and waking people up over an intercom system once I observed they had gone through a dream, tape recording the dream report, and to stay up during the night, I needed good material to read. And one of the investigators of this project was a psychologist who later transplanted to San Francisco at Saybrook, named Stanley Krippner. I don't know if that name is familiar to you. Anyway, Stanley had a remarkable library replete with everything that had ever been published up to that point. This was 72, 73, on psychedelics. Journal articles, books, everything. And I just devoured this, and I referenced it back to my experience in the late '60s at Oberlin, and I hadn't done any substances since, but I just became fascinated with this. And my father at that point, I should say, I had left school. I really didn't have a sense of much direction. My father was concerned about my lack of direction, so he told me, son, if you ever figure out what you want to do with your life, call me. I don't care what time of the day or night it is, call me. So here it was, 3 in the morning. I'm monitoring these EEGs. I'm reading this remarkable material on psychedelics, and I had an epiphany. I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And my dad had told me I needed to call him, so I was a good son. I called him, woke him up from a deep sleep, but he was okay, he had a good attitude. Finally figured out why I was calling. He said, "Okay, son, what is it that you want to do?" "I want to study psychedelics. They're absolutely fascinating. And there's so much we can learn about the brain and the mind-brain interface and mental illness. And there are these remarkable treatment models that seem to be having positive effects for patient populations that don't do well with regular treatments." So he was quiet for a while, and he said, and this determined the course of my life since, he said, "Well, son, there may be something to what you say, but no one will listen to you unless you get your credentials." So then I had to go back to school, do all the pre-med, and then by the time I finished medical school in '79, psychedelics were just off the board. They had disappeared. They had vanished from the field. There were absolutely no studies. no discussion, no dialogue on the topic, and but I kept plugging away. I ended up first in medicine, then neurology, and then realized I needed to go. The motivation to go into psychiatry, which was the original motivation to become to get the MD, was coming across Stan Grof's first two books in the Stanford Medical Bookstore one day, and I just devoured them over the course of a weekend. And I realized I needed to bite the bullet and go into psychiatry because that would be the most relevant area to work with psychedelics. But for years there was no interest. I would spend my free time in I trained and worked at Hopkins for a long time, and I would be in the stacks of the old medical library at Hopkins, just looking up material from the 1890s on mescaline, because it was very interesting, and the early 20th, the first decade of the 20th century, very interesting descriptions of first-hand experiences by luminaries like Havelock Ellis, William James, other prominent figures, and but still no interest in researching psychedelics to speak of within the field. Eventually, after a number of years at Hopkins, I retransplanted out west, ended up at UC Irvine, and one day saw an article in the Archives of General Psychiatry by a Hopkins neurologist named George Riccardi, basically making the case that MDMA was neurotoxic. And I read it again, gave copies to a couple of colleagues, we discussed it, and we agreed that the article was seriously flawed. The methodology was problematic. The interpretation of the results were questionable, and the conclusions didn't seem to jive with what they were really doing. And so I wrote a response. I wrote a letter to the editor of the archives, and about a month after my letter came out, I got a call one day from this guy who says, "Well, you don't know me, but my name is Rick Doblin, and I saw Sasha Shulgin showed me your letter to the editor in the archives, and I think we should talk. I'll be in LA next week. Why don't we arrange a time to get together and meet?" So we spoke, and Rick was looking for a psychiatrist who'd be willing to take the lead on developing a phase 1 study with MDMA in normal volunteers. And I said, "Yeah, well, I'm your man. It's something I've wanted to do for a long time." And so that was how the MDMA study happened. The ayahuasca work really started through my friendship with Dennis Mckenna. And one day Dennis described that he was working on a protocol. He had made some connections with members of a syncretic ayahuasca church in Brazil, the União de Vegetal, and they would be willing to host a research team if to do a formal biomedical psychiatric research study. And I asked Dennis who he was working with on this study. He said, "Well, I'm going to work with Rick Strosman." And I said, "Oh, Rick did the first DMT study." And I said to Dennis, "I know Rick very well, and I kind of doubt he'll still be in the project by the time you're ready to go to Brazil. So do me a favor, when Rick calls you and tells you that he, for whatever reason, he can't make it, call me, because I'll be willing to do it." And that's exactly what happened. I had a fascinating time in Brazil, made a number of additional trips, did an additional study with looking at the functional health of adolescents whose parents were in the UDV, the kids had been exposed to ayahuasca in utero, had been baptized into the ayahuasca church. Since they hit puberty, they had the option of attending occasional family ceremonies where ayahuasca was administered, but there was some pushback from the Brazilian judiciary. Ayahuasca had been legalized across the board in the late 80s, but this was about 10 years later, and there was questions among more conservative elements that this might not be appropriate for young people. So we did a fairly extensive study looking at a large cohort of UDV kids who'd been exposed in utero, did not use any ayahuasca until they hit puberty, and then, you know, would have that opportunity. And these were the kids who stepped up and said they wanted to participate with their families. And then we had a matched group of controls who had never been exposed. So we got some very good data, published a number of articles, and then the other drug I've been involved with is psilocybin, I did the pilot looking at the use of a psilocybin treatment model with individuals with advanced stage cancer and reactive severe existential anxiety, severe anxiety, but of an existential nature. And there had been some of the best research to come out of the 60s were with patient populations like this. You have people like Stan Grof and Gary Fisher and Walter Pankey and Eric Cast, Sidney Cohen. They were really some of the leading people in the field, and the results were just mind-blowing. And the first book that weekend at Stanford, I spent reading Grof's books. One of them was called Human Encounters with Death, and it was about a study he did with his first wife, Joan Halifax, on terminal cancer patients, and using LSD and DPT. We use psilocybin. So I was a founding board member for the Hefter Research Institute. Dave Nichols was the founding president, and I got into at one of our meetings. I got into a conversation with Dave about what should Hefter do next, sort of thing, and we decided it'd be great to pursue and at that point there had been no clinical treatment studies approved, but we felt this population we might have a chance of getting full approval. So we went for it with FDA, and a lot of back and forth, a lot of dialoguing with FDA. We had to address their concerns, their questions, changes they wanted. We kind of went through everything, a give and take back and forth. And at the end of the day, we got our approval, and we did what turned out to be the first study of this sort since the late 60s. So yeah, that's kind of the short version. I probably left some things out, but I've been in this field now actively since really the late 80s, early 90s. I have my day job, kind of my, work. I'm the director of child and adolescent psychiatry at Harvard UCLA. And that came about simply because, I like kids. I've always been around. I've been oldest of a large family and always around kids. And, it just was a natural fit for me. But, in academic medicine, you're supposed to carve out a niche area of interest and expertise and study it, write about it. And this, I just happened to have chosen a kind of an unusual, at least back when I got started, it was an unusual area for a young academician to get involved with. Now it's becoming increasingly a popular area to think about, write about, consider studies about. So the field is really opening up pretty rapidly, but for the longest time it was virtually moribund. Keeping in mind that when everything was shut down, the late 60s, early 70s, it stayed shut down in terms of human studies pretty much entirely until Strosman's study, which started in '92. And then after that, there was my phase 1 MDMA study, and then right after my study was a phase 1 ibogaine study at my University of Miami with Deborah Mash, a neuroscientist there. And then there was kind of a long gap again, and then the next significant study was Francisco Moreno at University of Arizona in the early 2000s, did a pilot on using a psilocybin treatment study with chronic refractory obsessive compulsive disorder. And then finally, MAPS got its first PTSD treated with chronic PTSD treated with MDMA, going with Michael Mithofer in South Carolina being the lead, the lead investigator there. So there, that's my, I guess, the short version.
Thank you for that wonderful history, Dr. Grobe. Um, Out of curiosity, do you remember what you were reading before you called your dad?
What I was reading. Oh, geez. Who knows? I was just taken with really the history of the field. So I was, delving into the studies from the 50s and the 60s, but also some of the old anthropologic record. I really found that of great fascination. Now, something I didn't quite realize, when I first got involved in this area, that the use of these compounds for sacred purposes, purposes of healing, you know, purposes relevant to belief systems, go back millennia. In one of my talks, I have a slide of it's actually a Kathleen Harrison drawing based on a cave painting in the southern Algerian area of Tassili, and it's of a shaman with mushrooms sticking, kind of coming out, popping out of his limbs, his torso, with a beehive mask. The beehive significant because in the ancient world there was no refrigeration, and to preserve plants and fungal material, they found honey was a good preservative. So that's the basis of the beehive mask. But this cave painting, it dates back 7,000 years. So, the use by our ancient ancestors, predates written language, predates the onset of what we would consider the great civilizations. It was part of the early human experience, and and has been implicated in the development of language. There was an anthropologist named Henry Munn who wrote about this in the 50s, that the sense of awe and wonderment led to efforts to convey that to one's companions, perhaps even prior to language. And Terence McKenna took that theme and elaborated it even further and more poetically. But yeah. So I don't quite remember what it was I was reading, but I just read a lot at that time.
So you spoke quite a bit about, how long research was quote unquote dead, and that you were one of the few people kind of still working towards this. So I guess I'm wondering, were there any points where you got discouraged, like, the non-significant results for your psilocybin trial? Were there moments where you had doubts and thought maybe this is time I should recede?
You know, I well, recently I'm having some doubts. We can get into that in a minute. But going back, I never had any doubts about the importance of exploring the psychedelic model. I certainly had some doubts about other aspects of my career. Mainstream psychiatry seemed at times very drab and very stultified. I remember when I transferred from neurology into psychiatry. The day I arrived, the training director in my new psychiatry program invited me into his office to welcome me, and he said, "Charlie, this is 1980. You're entering psychiatry at a very pivotal time in history. There's a tremendous, exciting new developments, and I have on my desk here a book that is going to change the face of psychiatry." And I'm thinking, this is great. He's got Stan Grof's collected volumes or whatever, and we'll share that. No, this is nothing to do with Stan Grof, nothing to do with psychedelics. He said, "I have the copy of the first edition of the DSM-3, and this will change psychiatry." And it did change psychiatry, but not in a good way. I think it's very limiting, and I think it's evolved since. But it's a manual to use for insurance purposes, for the most part, and to standardize how people see things, but nothing to do with psychiatry. So for a long time, I struggled with being in psychiatry, being a mainstream psychiatrist, and really in many respects keeping my secret interest just that, kind of a secret. I'd be very careful who I would mention the topic to. I only would bring it up if I knew an individual had some interest in this. So I actually almost left psychiatry to go back to medicine, where I felt maybe more of an affinity. It was more straightforward about the treatment models, and I come from a family of internists, but there's something held me back, and it may have been there was a great bookstore near the hospital where I was training, started my training in psychiatry in L.A., the Bodhi Tree bookstore, and I had my little ritual of every week going over there, going over to a couple of shelves on a bookcase off in the rear of the shop, which was the psychedelic section, maybe 2 shelves. And I was every week I was there to see what's new, what has come out that I haven't seen, just to kind of really feed the passion I had felt earlier, and the sense of this is very important, and this is an area that needs to be developed, and this is what I would like to devote myself to. So that kind of held me in check from jumping ship. I jumped a few ships, but I didn't jump that ship to go back into medicine. And I'm happy I didn't, because over time I took a long time, but eventually I went from the West Coast back to the East Coast and Baltimore for a number of years, and then I was recruited for a job at UC Irvine, where I met a few colleagues, including Roger Walsh, and there was a senior professor. He's one of the kind of the pioneers of transpersonal psychology and psychiatry. I remember after meeting him, we went out for lunch, and I was telling him I was somewhat disillusioned with the field and thinking of going back into medicine. And he said, well, if you could do anything, what would you do? Anything. I said, well, I know exactly what I want to do, but it's not possible. He said, well, what is it? I want a psychedelics for reason A, reason B, reason C. He said, I think that's fantastic. I think there is something to what you say, and you should do it. And so basically hang in there, which is what I did. And so getting that validation from a very senior, prominent individual like Roger really helped kind of solidify my position. And just a matter of being patient, waiting for the rest of the world to come around. That meant Rick, visiting with Rick, connecting with Dennis, and then Dave Nichols starting Hefter and asking me to be on the board. And that also really fueled the fire, and it brought me in contact with people who shared these interests. I went through most of the 80s until the late 80s knowing virtually no one. A few people in Baltimore, kind of the remnants of the old Spring Grove program when I was at Hopkins, but no one doing any active work, and not much in the way of activity going on around the country. And really, again, like I said, it wasn't until Strosman was able to pull off, I think, a very significant accomplishment of getting permission to do his DMT study. That really, then you had a sense that it was possible. We could actually take this challenge on, and in the right setting, the right circumstances, with the right personnel and the right goals, we could do this, and we were able to. The early 90s were a busy time in that regard. Doing the MDMA study, doing the Ayahuasca study, almost concurrently. But and later the psilocybin work, and then all the writing I've done. So and speaking, so I haven't regretted for a second that I took on such an unusual area of interest and stuck with it, and was able to I think accomplish a few things, at least allow the field, help the field to jumpstart again, and facilitate movement forward. Kind of mentoring some young people who very pleased that they're taking more prominent positions and helping the field to go forward, and then other investigators who maybe were keeping their interest to themselves started to step up. Like Roland Griffiths, who's done fabulous work at Johns Hopkins. But Roland went through a good chunk of his career, he, keeping whatever interest he may have had with psychedelics very quiet, very much to himself. And it was only in the early 2000s that he felt it was safe enough and feasible to start to move these interests forward. He was a drug researcher, but very different kinds of drug. He was an expert in the range of effects of caffeine, not psychedelics. But he's done remarkable work, and his productivity has been very, very important.
Kevin, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Grobe, for all of that incredible information and history. I have a question for you, and then we also have a couple of questions in the chat from Mariana, but I'll go ahead first. And you alluded a couple of times in your in what you were saying just now to this kind of like tension between your interest in psychedelics as being kind of like so underground and a bit taboo when talking to the mainstream medical community that you were working in your day job in. And I think a lot of us in this association really empathize with that, as people who are excited and passionate about this idea, but are experiencing this difficulty in making it a career right now, right? But I think that there is a transformation happening in the world where it's starting to be the case that there are jobs to be had by both researchers and medical personnel, ketamine clinics, and then the preparation for MDMA psychotherapy and all of the institutions associated with that. So I want to ask you, as pharmacists, as medical professionals that are interested in the space, what is your prediction for how we can get involved, how we can use our time and energy to be basically paid to get involved in this field to advance the profession? What's your predictions, and do you have any recommendations for us?
Yeah. So, so when I got involved, there was nothing going on. People would tell me, "Oh, this is a career killer. You better not talk to anybody about this." But that was 2-3 decades ago, and times have changed. And now sometimes a week doesn't go by without seeing a major article in a newspaper or a magazine including prominent publications, like New York Times, Washington Post, some of the major magazines as well. I think a big factor in the opening up to psychedelics again was Michael Pollan's book. Michael Pollan published a book several years ago, How to Change Your Mind, I think was.
That's right.
What was it? And he's a big time author. He's kind of a celebrity author, and he's the kind of individual that in our culture, what he's interested in has instant credibility. So people read very closely what he had to say, and they got the message from his book that the field is opening up and there's great potential. And that led to kind of an area that I have some mixed feelings about, which is that big money started to come into the field. And we were, working in this area, like working along with Hefter and some other colleagues, funding was always critical. Funding was always very, very tight. So we were always going after funding, but it was always either grants or philanthropic funding. The new kind of funding that's entered into the field now is from for-profit businesses. And that, I'm a little uneasy about that, because I think when profit is a primary motive, we may start looking at ways to reduce cost. And reducing costs may create some new safety concerns. If one way to reduce cost is to have clinicians with maybe a lower bar to get over in terms of their qualifications. Would someone with less training, less clinical experience, miss a condition which might exclude the patient from the study? Cutting costs might also mean having only one facilitator in the room as opposed to two. I think having two is a good safety feature to have for a bunch of reasons, and to just be cutting costs like that to increase return on investment and increase the profits that are going to be garnered, it just makes me uneasy. And particularly a treatment model that has such a strong kind of psycho-spiritual core to the experience. When you mix it up with capitalism, I'm afraid it could go off the rails. But again, my approach from the very start was, I'll do this, but I'll get the credentials I need. So you guys already have good, solid credentials, and it's a matter of finding a setting where the supervisors or the directors of programs would be accommodating. And I think with the very, very positive new media coverage, that's becoming, I think, more and more feasible. And also, honestly, knowing that there's more funding out there makes it a more attractive area to develop research in as well. So, and why? Another reason why this might be the case is the passage of time. When I was starting out, the people in charge had been around, in the 60s, 70s. They knew Tim Leary. They had a very negative mindset towards Tim Leary. But these guys have, they got old. They've moved on one way or another, and the people coming behind them taking their place are younger people for whom Tim Leary's name doesn't evoke that same kind of knee-jerk negative reaction as once was the case. So I think getting younger people into positions of leadership, we're more likely to see a willingness to really to kind of take a chance with this new area, because the payoff, and by this I mean its clinical utility, is potentially great. So I think the times are far more opportune, and we just honestly, we needed the passage of half a century to kind of put those old memories in mothballs and figure those are artifacts of history and reflective of a culture which was not sufficiently mature to take on such profound compounds that are catalysts for change.
Well said. Thank you, Dr. Grobe.
Question from Mariana. So considering the prevalence of polypharmacy and many treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions, how do you think psychedelic-assisted treatment may help these patients?
Well, that's a real problem. We tend to use a lot of polypharm, and what you see is you get a difficult patient. They're on a regimen of meds. Your patient's not doing well, and a lot of clinicians will just start adding additional medications. And before you know it, you've got a hodgepodge of meds that, they're, for starters, they're not working. They may have problematic interactions with one another. So I think maybe clinicians need to start looking at, polypharm regimens which are not effective and maybe particularly problematic. And then I think you have the question of could treatment with a psychedelic obviate or eliminate the need for our standard medications? And that would be a very provocative issue. And there's certainly a lot of patients I could think of that I wouldn't want to check that out, just because of the relative risk. But if some of the early information coming out about psychedelic treatment is accurate and remains consistent, then we may have a treatment model which could eliminate or at least reduce the need for the polypharm regimen. Maybe simplify the regimen, or some individuals may be able to do without altogether. With the psilocybin terminal cancer study we did, we had to take people off of SSRIs and a lot of the other meds, and I had a couple people say, "Okay, I'll do the gradual taper for this study, but as soon as it's over, I'm going to go back on my Zoloft or my Prozac or whatever." And as it turned out, after the treatment and throughout the long follow-up data collection period, the subjects I'm thinking of did not feel there was a pressing need to go back to the meds they were on, that they had this, and that's one of the beauties of the psychedelic model, if it holds up, the sustained therapeutic effect over time. It's not like with conventional meds, you know, we're looking at symptom reduction in the here and now, as long as they can sustain a certain level of the medication. But with the psychedelic model, it's certainly there's some data to indicate that positive effects can sustain over weeks, months, and who knows, perhaps years. We don't really have a lot of follow-up data, but there's some preliminary evidence out there that, and that, again, that's one of the beauties of this model, if it holds up, that the therapeutic effects sustain for long periods over time.
Another question from the audience.
Okay, sure.
Have you ever done psychedelic research in treatment of various addictions? Where do psychedelics fit in the bio, psychosocial, and spiritual model of management of substance use disorders?
Right. Well, I mean, I haven't personally done a substance abuse treatment study, but I certainly am aware of what's in the literature and the current studies and the data. Look, the two areas, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, the two clinical indications that showed the most promise with psychedelics, one were, as I mentioned, working with terminal cancer patients, people at the end of life in existential crisis. The other was working with chronic alcoholics. You know, one of the notoriously one of the most difficult areas to treat in all of medicine is alcohol abuse. You know, really all we've got now, I think, is pretty much what we had 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, which is a 12-step group. And if it's a good fit, it could work wonders. But if it's not a good fit, it's a condition that is, you know, replete with many, many relapses. And the data, though, coming out of the old work going back to Humphrey Osmond in Saskatchewan in the 50s, you know, through the 60s, some of Grof's work at Spring Grove, and then the recent work, first in New Mexico and now at NYU with Michael Bogenschutz working with alcohol abuse disorder, the data has been consistently very, very strong. So certainly there's a lot of data looking at the use of treatment of alcoholism, you know, look, if we look at the value of the 12-step model, part of that might be that it acknowledges kind of a psycho-spiritual dimension to alcoholism and to recovery, and here we have a treatment model which, under optimal conditions, optimal setting, might very well reliably facilitate powerful psycho-spiritual experiences. That was also one of the beauties of some of the early Roland Griffiths work at Hopkins, that he demonstrated that under optimal setting conditions, you could reliably induce powerful spiritual level experiences, which seemed to be a critical component, you know, for like an AA model, but also looking back on Grof's work, Pankey's work, you found that and going back to Osmond in the 50s, the best treatment outcomes were those people who had, during the course of what was often one session, but a many-hour session, had a powerful psychospiritual epiphany. They had that mystico-mimetic flash, and they got it. And having had that, if you did follow-ups 6 months later, or a year later, 2 years later, these were the people who, whatever the treatment focus was, they had the best therapeutic outcome, whether it was not drinking or whether it was coming to terms with a potentially fatal illness. These were your best outcomes, people with who had that spiritual level experience.
Great, thank you. So we touched a bit upon present day status of the field. about 2 years ago, you, Alicia Danforth, and Brian Anderson wrote a comment in the Lancet, nice, concise, important comment about the safety and ethical concerns of psychedelic medicine. Since then, a lot has come out over the past 2 years. So I'm curious how your thoughts have changed since you wrote that. Do you feel more strongly?
Oh yeah,
Um,
I'm glad
yeah.
we wrote it. That's a very important area, and sadly, in the last couple of years, there have been some uh, inappropriate behaviors on the part of psychedelic therapists or facilitators, both within formal research studies and in the underground, that have come to life, that have gotten a lot of, publicity. There was a New York Magazine podcast, the end of 2021, the beginning of 2022. It's called Cover Story. If you haven't seen it or listened to it, it's worth listening to, and it's pretty shocking and very, very disturbing. So highlighting ethics, I think, is really important moving forward. If there are a series of ethical missteps and inappropriate behaviors, that's a sure formula to derail the field or to stall it out. There really have, as in all of the our profession, particularly the healing arts, there needs to be strong ethical parameters. I think particularly so with psychedelics. Remember, one quality of psychedelics is they amplify experience. So inappropriate behavior in a state of normative consciousness can clearly be damaging. That same inappropriate behavior while someone is under the influence of a psychedelic can be damaging multifold to what it would be under normal conditions. And then also, the other part of the article was pay attention to safety. That's why I like Keelan's articles and his chapter in my book so much. This is a really important and often inadequately appreciated area that we really have to do our due diligence. And honestly, I think a problem or a flaw in the current field is we haven't gone back and done sufficient safety testing, medical safety testing, starting with our normal volunteers. How about starting with older subjects? The studies I've done, we had a cutoff age of 60 or 65, and that seemed awfully old way back when. Now I'm older than that now. Then that our cutoff, it doesn't seem so old. But also with the end of life work and the Pollen book and issue about kind of treatment of existential anxiety, you're going to see more older people get interested in having experiences. These might be some of my peers from the 60s who haven't touched a psychedelic in 50 years but want to get back into it, or it could be individuals who are entirely naive and never had a history of taking psychedelics. How does it affect cardiovascular function? There's and Keelan writes about this, there's the 5-HT2B effects. What is that? And that's involved with protecting structural integrity of cardiac valves. What if there's a, perturbation of that system? What if, let's say, a microdose model, even though a tiny dose, but on a daily basis or every few days basis for a period of time, what is that likely to do with effects on cardiovascular function, for which older people would be more vulnerable? There is a case, not published, but it's made the rounds over the past 2 years, just informally. Is that through a document written by the daughter of a 74-year-old man, entirely naive to psychedelics, but read the Pollen book and got real excited and felt it was time for him to check this out. Arranged for what he understood to be a reputable underground therapist to come and provide the mushrooms and facilitate. And the guy, from what we're told, had a clean medical history, for whatever that was worth. Well, he ingested a moderate dose of mushrooms, and within an hour or two had deceased. Autopsy said, presumed, cardiac arrhythmia secondary to psilocybin ingestion. But we need to be doing more extended EKGs in individuals having these experiences. For our terminal cancer study, we actually had Holter monitors on people, so we could measure this. And what we found was actually that that there were a lot of arrhythmias, but in both the active drug condition and the placebo condition. All that tells us is we need to study this further. It's we really do need to do a better job at exploring safety. Then there's the drug interactions. I published an article in the late 90s with Jace Calloway from the University of Kuopio in Finland, one of my ayahuasca research colleagues. And we had, either firsthand observed or had heard about several cases of individuals who were on an SSRI antidepressant who took ayahuasca and had what certainly appeared to be a serotonin syndrome. Those can be very dangerous, certainly very distressing to the individual and everyone around them, because it's not a silent crisis. It's a very noisy crisis, and potentially dangerous for the individual. So we need to get more information about and that particular drug interaction, likely because of the MAOI effects of the hormonal alkaloids that are in the Banisteriopsis, part of the ayahuasca. But there's precious little preclinical work on looking at drug interactions, safety issues. So I think there needs to be a little slowing down and kind of going back and making sure that some loose ends are tied up, so that we we're not missing any serious safety issues. And to that end, I think we should get rid of the upper age limit. I think we need to be exploring older subject populations, because they're more likely to have the medical problems we might run into, and they're going to be wanting this treatment, which is very different from 20 years ago. Everyone was quite young back then.
Yeah, some excellent points there about the need for
greater
emphasis on basic science. Sorry, go ahead.
Another thing was, with my MDMA study, we had a couple of guys who had pretty serious hypertensive reactions to the MDMA. And one of them was a guy who was in for his third session, and the first two, his blood pressure regulation was just fine, a normal baseline, and no history of a problem. Third session, it was off the roof. It was like 210 or 220 over 100 or 110. It was making my blood pressure going up just looking at the numbers. So I talked with him. I said, well, something's got to be different today than the last couple of times you came in and we treated you. Anything that you haven't told us this morning? And he said, well, I didn't want to bother you because I didn't think it was important. But he told me a story. We started our sessions early. To get to the hospital early, he stayed with a friend who lives close to the hospital. His friend had a cat. The subject was allergic to cats, and he had some breathing problems in the morning. And his friend said, oh, try some of my asthma medication. It'll help your breathing. Well, it may help the breathing, but it also caused a whopping hypertensive reaction. So we need to be cognizant of that. It reminds me of a study in the late 80s in I think the Annals of Internal Medicine. The title says it all. The title was The Agony After Ecstasy. And this was a guy who ended up in the San Francisco General Emergency Room with a hypertensive crisis. And he was on an MAOI and took MDMA. So there you have it. He was lucky. They got his blood pressure down. He was close enough to a high quality medical center. But safety and ethics really need to be priorities for this field moving forward, or we're likely to incur more regrettable events that could be injurious to individuals and could also hold this field back.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for speaking so at length on that subject because of its importance. Sarah, I see you have your hand up. I'm just going to ask Leia's question first, and then you can go. What do you think about the portrayal of psychedelics in the media, brackets, movies, TV shows? On one hand, it is decreasing stigma of these drugs, but on the other hand, it's often recreational with little emphasis on the spiritual and therapeutic properties.
Yeah, yeah. I have an adverse reaction, like when I see ayahuasca depicted as a recreational vehicle. It just seems so disrespectful and dangerous, and it gives people absolutely the wrong impression. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there have been some, very good documentaries, that I think really stick to the truth. They interview people who know what they're talking about, and they're well, fantastic fungi. The greats is like the Paul Stamets story, the ethnomycologist, who's a fascinating character, and the filmmaker is a really good filmmaker, and it's I think a really good watch. Yeah,
And
so
psychic,
but I'm always very uneasy when Hollywood wants to just use psychedelics and gets it wrong. It just I walk away with just a bad feeling in my mouth.
Any nerves about the Michael Pollan Netflix thing then?
Oh, is it out? I
I
haven't
no, not yet.
seen it. I mean, actually, I had a number of discussions with the filmmakers they seemed capable and seemed to know what they were doing. They were going to come to LA and film me, but it was during the peak of the pandemic, and I said it's I couldn't do it. I'm happy to do a Zoom interview, but not if they wanted a face to face. So I didn't stay in touch with them, so I'm not really sure how it's going to be. Yeah. The Pollen book, the book was great. It was excellent, but it's also fairly controversial. Not everybody liked it, but it did serve a purpose of making this topic more acceptable to the mainstream, more acceptable and more intriguing.
Sarah, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So from my understanding, in the field when I read articles, it's often about a single condition like PTSD, depression, addiction. And so, often these conditions are tied to others in the comorbid or multiple morbid senses. And my question is, I'm wondering, your thoughts on future studies, and these might exist, I don't know, about studies that specifically look at comorbid conditions in which each condition by itself is often thought to be treated with a different psychedelic, with, let's say, depression and psilocybin, PTSD and MDMA. Do you think that one condition in a study would be emphasized over another, or do you see multiple psychedelics being used in these comorbids?
Yeah, I don't know about multiple psychedelics. That's a whole other topic. But that is an important point you're raising. That many of our cases, there's comorbidity. There's not just one element of psychopathology. There's a host of things. So an example is another study I did a few years ago with Alicia Danforth was an MDMA treatment of young adults with incapacitating social anxiety. And we got very good results with the measures we used. But one thing we found, which we weren't necessarily expecting, was quite a number of these subjects also had pretty clear evidence for chronic PTSD. I mean, these were Asperger young people growing up. They're marks, they're targets, and they're very vulnerable often, very sensitive. And they were carrying around these unrecognized PTSD symptoms. And it often came out in the treatment, and we dealt with it. And they had a good outcome, both with their reduction in social anxiety, but also the kind of coming to terms with a lot of the old trauma. And so there was that. And then there's the other issue of what are the ideal compounds for particular conditions. We tend to associate MDMA as as a putative treatment for PTSD because MAPS has been exceptionally active studying this area, and MDMA is the drug they use. Personally, I'm waiting for someone to roll out a psilocybin treatment of chronic PTSD study or a head-to-head study, because I think it's I think these compounds are, you know, look, it may end up that MDMA is the optimal treatment for chronic PTSD, but I certainly know of a number of cases where, you know, psilocybin or ayahuasca appeared to be, you know, very therapeutic for chronic PTSD. There's a group of military veterans with terrible PTSD who, for some reason or another, got it into their heads that they didn't want to do an MDMA treatment, but rather they wanted to go to the South American Amazon and spend a month at an ayahuasca retreat. And from what they're saying, they had some, you know, excellent outcomes. So I wouldn't have expected that with ayahuasca. I might have even come up with an argument why we shouldn't move in that direction, but you know, if they're to be believed, if their reports are accurate, then that's another area that could be looked at. You know, a powerful psychedelic medication, but applied for a condition that one has normally not considered.
Kevin, I see your question there, but I believe there was one in the chat right before then. Actually, a two-part question. What are your thoughts on companies trying to patent manufacturing processes and or derivatives of psychedelic drugs? And subsequently, any thoughts on taking synthetic versus natural psilocybin?
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the patent issue. I'm appalled. I really am very, very concerned by this. It's not. There's been a fight for some time with an organization called Compass, who not only want to patent some, maybe it's an analog, maybe it's not an analog of psilocybin, of an alternative structure, but they're taking out use patents on what kind of music, what kind of decorations, what kind of chair you're going to sit in. And it just seems very disturbing. Especially, I consulted with this group back, you know, I don't know, 2013 or 14, and they presented as a philanthropic operation. They're clearly a for-profit, and so that I feel a little burned because I spent a lot of time. I visited them in the UK. I gave talks on their behalf, so that kind of bothers me. And now you may not be aware, just in the last couple of weeks, there's another big controversy breaking out in the patent world, in that a group at NYU, will say close colleagues and friends of mine, but they've now taken the step to, with a private company, patent the use of psilocybin to treat end-of-life demoralization and anxiety. And I'm thinking, you know, wait a second, this is not right. We have my study, we had Roland Griffith's study, and we had the guys in the 60s. You know, we had Groff, we had Pankey, we had Fisher, we had Cohen, we had Eric Cass. What about them? What about the indigenous people going back time memorial? You know, you're gonna say you have this. So they're making the case that they have an original invention. The word is invention. Seems fallacious. And so, but it's a concern. It is a major concern. You've got the chairman of NYU, who's part of this big business. He's probably seeing dollar signs floating before his eyes. He's not going to walk away from something like this. And you've got a friend of mine, Steve Ross, who seems to be involved in this as well. And I'm very disappointed with Steve and the decisions he's making. I don't think. One way or another, it's not gonna end well. You know, it won't end well because that whole thing will fall apart, and they'll tarnish their reputations and maybe the field, or it won't end well because maybe the patent will be issued, and then what is that going to do with future research in the field? Will it throw roadblocks? you know, or getting this out there as an established protected treatment. You're going to have to fork over a percent to whoever holds the patent. This, in my mind, is really problematic, and so far, at least, the media has steered clear. We'll see what they do, but it's a potential huge problem. And that's been one of the bigger developments of the last few years is the onslaught, the rushing in of the for-profits, just trying to carve out their piece of the pie. Reminds me of the Oklahoma. I love history, so the Oklahoma land rush, right, where you had this big area that had formerly belonged to the indigenous people. It got stolen away from them like everything else did. But all the settlers, or people who wanted to be settlers, they all collected in a certain area. They lined up, at the designated areas and waited for someone to shoot a pistol into the air. And that would mean just take off as fast as you can, get to an area that looks pretty good, and put your claim flag down and go for it. That's what the four patents seem sometimes. That it's going to be this rush to carve out areas that for-profits who may have little to none experience working with these compounds, but they've got the business savvy and the connections to make it happen. That worries me.
I believe Kevin has a question, but to your earlier point with the NYU reset patent application, some patent lawyers have chimed in the past few weeks, and they say it's not likely to be granted just because there is so much prior art and it's based on a follow-up of their study. So we'll see.
One would hope. I mean, I actually gave my protocol to Steve when he said he wanted to do this. So it's like, who forms the foundation of that? But there's also a good blog that just went up a couple of weeks ago. Are you familiar with forget the guy's name, but he's a patent expert.
Matt Zorner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe you could provide that link to the other guy.
Share that.
It's good, but it's a blog. It's not like it's not in the New York Times. I don't believe it till I see it in the New York Times. That's my upbringing.
That's funny. Dr. Grobe, I think it was really interesting, the comments you had about the for-profit space getting involved in the psychedelic stuff and this patents. And, as a disclosure for myself, I work in a pharmaceutical company that's interested in working on psychedelics. So thinking about these questions and how to be beneficent in this space is a question I think about very frequently. So I want to ask you, and, for other colleagues in industry or people who are interested in, how these compounds will make their way into the medical world. Given what you said about how patents are being abused right now, could you think of any meaningful beneficent ways that pharmaceutical companies can use the vehicle?
I spoke with a guy recently who described a very wealthy guy who's investing, creating his own company in this area. But he tells me his plan is, I don't know, it's 15 or 20, maybe 15, 10 or between 10 and 20% of the profit, and direct it specifically towards an operation that is dedicated to purchasing land for indigenous people who have had their land stolen over the centuries and the millennia, and they're returning it to them, returning their sacred territories to them. That struck me as fairly enlightened, and a company that held to that model would certainly have my support.
Those are reciprocity models, and there are a number of companies that are.
Yeah, that I like, and I think I'd love it if private entities there was some way to hold them to that. That might take federal law, but
well, there is the North Star Initiative, which is this ethical group that is trying to create some ethical standards for companies involved in psychedelics. So they may, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
it remains to be seen how much teeth that has, but I think it's in the public
yeah.
consciousness.
But it also reflects really the debt we owe to the native peoples around the world, or their ancestors. Who these were the great mysteries, and they maintained those. They kept those secrets extant, even when they were subject to horrific persecution by those who thought that these plants were agents of the devil. So these people risked life and limb, to keep these mysteries alive. And I think that there needs to be some payback. There needs to be some reciprocity. We wouldn't know about these compounds for the most part, I think, without the indigenous people protecting the secrets. Like R. Gordon Wasson would never have trekked to Oaxaca to in search of to hunt down a rumor of an extant mushroom cult. If there was no mushroom cult, if Maria Sabina was not in a long line of curanderos and curanderos, saving that, holding on to that knowledge.
100%. We have to give thanks to the indigenous people and their knowledge. Yeah, for this culture.
Yeah. And including a literal payback.
Yeah.
Let them profit from. If these medicines are going to be a great boon to modern society, let the indigenous people are some of the more deprived, lower socioeconomic around the world. There's a lot of good we could do with the kind of profit that's being discussed, as opposed to it just going into the pockets of people who already are worth millions, if not billions.
Absolutely. And we should engage with that discussion. Michael, if I could just ask one more question real quick. And sorry to take up the time, but Dr. Grobe, I wanted to ask, with the pharmacists we have here, do you have any perhaps questions for us, our members here, about how pharmacists might be able to play a role in the psychedelic space, or the thoughts you have on the medical model and how we might get involved? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be all for pharmacists feeling empowered to speak up, speak to the greater medical community about these compounds, because you have knowledge and an area of expertise that's rather unique, and really emphasize safety issues. That to me is, if we can't create a strong safety platform, the field will inevitably go off the rails again. And that was one of the problems back in the 60s, that there was, in some settings, there was insufficient regard for optimizing set and setting, optimizing safety standards, and starting to look at drug interaction issues. We know something we know very little about. As I see it, psychedelics are the great medicine. Well, the prototype medicine, but let's make sure it's a safe medicine. So we need to. So, for instance, with Oregon, we got this exciting, initiative. It's going to be legal at a certain point in time. But what are they doing there, and what are they doing in Denver and Oakland and Santa Cruz and other places about educating the public about safety, safe use? Before we start plying them with, this is going to change your life in a positive way, and my product is better than all the other products, let's give them a lot of really good and relevant psychoeducation, so they understand who's not a good risk, who should be excluded. Oh, your father had schizophrenia? Maybe not. Maybe not. You have a history of severe cardiac arrhythmias? let's do some studies. Let's make sure we don't, you know, have blinders on and walk into an area that where we could create a severe problems.
I have one question, but Simi, I see you raised your hand. You can go ahead.
Oh, hey, thanks for this. And my question, you kind of touched on it in your last response, is about decriminalization and what your thoughts are there. As far as clinically, ethically, and where healthcare, where
Yeah, I've never thought the drug war accomplished much of anything beyond just furthering a lot of unnecessary suffering and ruining lives. So I think with the growth of the legalization of cannabis and the growth of that industry, and it's getting solidified in place and demonstrating, I think on the most part, good safety parameters. Um, uh, I think the drug war is fading away in many regards. So, and I've had close association for a long time with Ethan Nadelman, for DPA, leader of the kind of the fight against the drug war. So I'm totally in sync with, with the need to put the drug war behind us, because it really doesn't address issues. It doesn't achieve, making conditions safer, and it actually is an impediment to setting up safe standards, because you've got to sneak around and take compounds under suboptimal conditions. People at old Grateful Dead concerts back in the 80s or 90s, you know, some 20-year-old who was going around with a bag of mushrooms because he was caught up in the ethos of it, and then he sells to an undercover person, and then he's off to prison for 5 years or 10 years. What is that going to do to the trajectory of his life?
Yeah, thank you for those thoughts on prohibition and decriminalization in general. I think it's something most, if not all of us in this group have strong feelings about. We're getting close to time. I do have one question. I don't know how public this is at this point, but could you tell us a bit about the UCLA Psychedelic Studies Initiative and what you'll be working on moving forward?
Right. Well, yeah. So, along with a few colleagues at UCLA, we're basically trying to jumpstart a research center focus on psychedelics, and it's fairly preliminary. We're just kind of writing up our the structure and some of the issues, and we need to raise a fair amount of funding. And I'm a little concerned that the changes in the economy recently may put a block to that. But one study that is already funded and that is going through the regulatory process and likely to happen is a study I'm working on in collaboration with, I'm located at Harbor UCLA. I'm a professor at UCLA. And so it's with my campus at Harbor UCLA, the Westwood campus of UCLA, UCSF, Marin County General Hospital, and possibly two other facilities on the East Coast. So it'll be a multi-site study using a psilocybin treatment model for individuals approaching the end of life who are overwhelmed with feelings of demoralization. Yeah. So that study is likely to happen. Our IND application went into the FDA last week, and the FDA has been, I think, a very good partner to kind of process these protocols and to get feedback and get into a back and forth. I think they're open. They're more open than some of their predecessors were decades ago. And then we have to get through DEA, Research Advisory Panel in California, all the IRBs, make final decisions about sites. But it's going to be happening. So that'll be kind of I think the first big project that might be very well associated with the new UCLA psychedelic initiative. But for further studies, we're going to be tasked with raising some funds, and given the state of the world economy and the way it's moving in the last month or two, that may prove to be more challenging. What I want to avoid is making a deal with the devil and allowing big pharma money to come in with their focus on establishing patents and future profits. That would be problematic in my mind. But I think there's still individuals out there who feel who have the resources and are very upbeat about supporting studies on a philanthropic basis.
Did anyone have questions for Dr. Grobe? We're wrapping up soon.
Super quick question from me, Dr. Grobe. We are doing this book club series with the PPA, and we just finished your wonderful hallucinogens book. Do you have a recommendation for some other maybe less known book that might be a great read for us in a book club?
Oh, what is it called? Dennis Mckenna, The Brotherhood of the Eternal Abyss. It's a story of his life and relationship with his brother Terence McKenna.
Mm.
It's a good read, and Dennis is he's a great raconteur. So I'd certainly recommend that. And Terence, before he passed in 2000, had some some very good books that maybe could be part of this that Dennis could comment on. The Invisible Landscape was one. I mean, I got a bookshelf full of that stuff. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Rick Strosman, I forget the name of his book. He tends to veer on the controversial, but he's very interested in the interface, psychedelics with psychospiritual phenomena and formal religion. He likes to debate people and often doesn't agree, but he's very bright, very very accomplished, and historically he's a pivotal player. He got the first human study of a psychedelic approved in the modern era in 1991 or 92. We were the second, but he was the first. Another speaker you guys would like, he hasn't written books, but he's got a ton of articles, is David Nichols. There are two Dave Nichols. You got to keep that in mind. There's the guy who did the podcast for New York Magazine. Dave Nichols is his pseudonym, but he's a very bright guy. You could have him on too. He has a very interesting, YouTube thing of his own. But I'm referring to David Nichols, who's the former professor of pharmacology and medicinal chemistry at Purdue, now at the University of California in University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and really has done some very important work. The founding president of the Hefter Research Institute, as well, and he's a great talker.
Can you put us in touch if we don't have a connection already?
I can get you his contact.
All right, we may follow up.
Yeah,
sure. And also his son. You got to talk with his son, Chuck Nichols, who's at LSU, who is doing some of the most interesting work I've come across in a long time. It's all preclinical, but it says something. It's looking at exceedingly potent hallucinogen DOI, which evidently has strong anti-inflammatory effects, and he's treating or administering this DOI to mice that have been genetically bred to have allergic asthma. I mean, you expose them to a particular allergen, and they just start wheezing like crazy. He pre-treats them with DOI, and the mice are fine. So there's some inkling that could psychedelics we're all over psychedelics and mental health, but how about psychedelics and internal medicine? Particularly, let's say, autoimmune disease. No one has ever looked at this. But Chuck's work is fascinating, and I think it deserves, wider, readership or viewership or whatever. People need to be aware of this because it's important.
Absolutely. And yeah, let's hope the DEA doesn't follow through on the DOI scheduling and put a damper on that research.
Yeah.
Callan, you raised your hand. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about the origins of Hefter Research Institute and how that kind of came together.
Sure. Well, Arthur Hefter was a very famous professor of, I guess, chemistry or pharmacology in Germany in the late 1800s. And he had a colleague, Louis Lewin, known as the father of modern psychopharmacology, who obtained some samples of peyote from the American Southwest. And he was able to isolate a number of alkaloids and administer them to their animal models, but the animals didn't tell them which was the psychedelic alkaloid. So he realized he needed a human bioassay, let's say. He needed a human volunteer, and Hefter volunteered. So he was the first one to take a synthetic mescaline, so actually initially the name of of Hefter was supposed to be the Pankey Institute, but Rick Strosman, who was originally going to be part of this but dropped out very early on, he objected to Pankey's name. He said, "Oh, people will say there's hanky panky at the Pankey." We wanted to placate Rick, so Dave had a good second option, which was the Hefter Research Institute, and it's held. And I think Hefter has made a lot of important contributions. They are, by and large, responsible for my my pilot study with terminal cancer patients. So they provided the funding, and I work with them carefully on the methodology and working with the regulatory system. So yeah, especially Dave Nichols was a very, very significant part, and he's a wonderful speaker. I think you'd learn a lot, and he's a hardcore scientist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And for a bench scientist, he writes about as well as one might. He's really good, very, very very articulate.
I'll just add, Dr. Grobe, yeah, I'm quite close with Dr. Nichols because I worked with him at UNC Chapel Hill for a little while, and he's aware of the PPA. So I think we will have him to speak pretty soon.
Great, good. Who else is in the field? Who'd be good to talk? I mean, just to get a historical sense, Bill Richards at Hopkins works closely with Roland. He's one of the primary facilitators on all of Roland's studies. Bill Richards also worked with Walter Pankey in the mid-'60s at Spring Grove. So Bill is the only one left who spans the generations of researchers. He's quite elderly, but he's still working and still very active in the field. And he published kind of his memoir a couple of years ago, which I think a good, I forget the title, but
Sacred Knowledge. That's should be on our list as well.
Yeah, a very, very good read. Absolutely.
So on that note, on the subject of elders, Dr. Grobe, first, thank you for joining us. Thank you for compiling this wonderful book of knowledge from elders of the past. Everyone knows the saying, stand on the shoulders of giants. So thank you for your broad shoulders, and again, for joining us today. Yeah, and I think we can end on that note.
No, thank you. Enjoyed meeting you guys. Enjoyed talking with you all. This is a fun conversation. I thank you for inviting me.
Well,
Thanks
you're
again for joining us.
been great. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, evening, morning, maybe for some. Bye, everyone.
I'll see
Thanks
you.
so
Bye.
much.
Thanks
Bye.
everyone for joining.